Some Eurocentric writers have strongly propagated that the pre-colonial African societies had no laws prior to the arrival of the Europeans. This erroneous assumption has been based on the argument that the pre-colonial African societies had no indigenous system of social control that contained legal elements. If you're watching us for the very first time, please subscribe to our channel and click on the notification icon so that anytime we drop a new content, you will be one of the earliest persons to be notified. The major presentation of these Eurocentric writers were influenced by the biased reports of some European sea captains and traders that visited some part of Africa before the colonial period. These Eurocentric presentations are being documented and presented in error. The basic fact is that these propagations are false. Professor J.M. Eledigo, who is a professor of jurisprudence, has tried to clear the air on this false presentation. In his documentation, he dismissed these claims. He stated that the Eurocentric presentations were based on biasness and deep ignorance of facts, since no serious studies were carried out by the early European writers. An interesting thing is the existence of some documentations created in the 1930s by some British anthropologists that were commissioned to carry out studies in societies in eastern Nigeria. Their documentations revealed that the societies in that region had developed indigenous judicial systems before the arrival of the Europeans. This tends to be the situation in most, if not all, parts of Africa before the coming of the Europeans. Many societies in Africa had well-developed mechanisms of social control with well-defined and recognized moral and legal norms before the coming of the Europeans. African societies developed indigenous methods and procedures of lawmaking, enforcement, and sanctions, and as well methods of settlement of disputes. This can explain a society that was and is still well coordinated. This simply means that African societies were not barbaric before the coming of the Europeans, as being propagated by some biased writers. Sources of laws in the pre-colonial African societies can be in some of these ways. One major source of laws in the pre-colonial African society was through customs and tradition. Customs and tradition, which are passed down from one generation to another, are major sources of laws in Africa, even to the present day. They were major sources of laws before Europeans came, and till the present day, they are still major sources of law in Africa, mainly in the traditional settings. Till this present day, custom and tradition play a very important role in the traditional African societies. Customs and traditions cut across a lot of areas. Customs and traditions cut across a lot of areas. Some of these areas can be marriages, burial rites, parenting, religious activities, farming, family interactions, traditional ceremonies, and many other areas. Another major source of laws and principles before the coming of the Europeans were kings and other political office holders in the pre-colonial African societies. In most pre-colonial centralized political units in Africa, some kings had the opportunity of having executive, judicial, and legislative powers. Most of these kingship political structures were able to designate executive, judicial, and legislative roles to some political office holders based on the level of operation. Some of the kings in these centralized units were able to make laws, and some of their laws, they were also able to execute them and at the same time legislate on some areas. Another source of law in pre-colonial African society was religious-backed laws, religious activities. Most African religious activities before the coming of the Europeans were based on ancestral consultations. These consultations were carried out by chief priests and other African traditional priestly hierarchies. In some cases, major outcomes of these consultations end up becoming laws. This is because of the belief in some African societies that the chief priest communicates or commutes with the gods and the ancestors. Another area was paths. Paths was a very important area or means of generation of laws. This is another source of law in some African societies before the coming of the Europeans. In most cases, the paths were mainly agreements between two or more societies in a given area in African cultural setting. These agreements are made to be laws binding on individuals, groups, institutions within the societies involved in this path. For instance, based on lineage relationship, two or more societies in African setting might decide that they cannot intermarry. Such path becomes a law binding everyone in those societies. In most cases, sanctions are introduced in order to ensure compliance. Then another area through which laws were generated before the coming of the Europeans was through groups in a society. Some laws were created by some specific groups in the pre-colonial African society. Some of these groups were women groups, age grades, masquerade groups, men groups, youth groups, and other ones. Some of the laws generated by these groups were targeted at members of such groups. But in some cases, some of the laws were targeted at the whole society or the whole given society where the group exists. Some of the laws made by this group can as well, as I said, be made for the whole society. In some cases, such laws might require ratification by the leaders of such society. There was also the General Assembly. The General Assembly as a source of creation and execution of laws in African society. Some major laws were made by the General Assembly. This is mainly in some of the African societies that do not have centralized government. In most of them, the highest law and policy making body was the General Assembly. In some of these societies, the General Assembly was made up of all adult male citizens of such society. While in some, the General Assembly were made up of representatives of the different lineages that made up such society. So, the information or the propagation that Africa had no laws or no law-making mechanisms before the coming of the Europeans can be said to be outright false. The highest level of misinformation perpetrated by the Eurocentric writers was the claim that African societies had no indigenous system of social control that contained legal elements. This means that the writers refer to Africa and Africans as barbarians. This is the highest level of ignorance and biasness. Till this present day, some pre-colonial laws made by Africans are the basis for social harmony in some African traditional societies. These laws were not made during the colonial period, and they were not as well created or copied from the Europeans. Please, if you're watching us for the very first time, subscribe to our channel and click on the notification icon, and as well share our contents so as for it to reach people that may desire them. Thanks for being part of this channel.